Hey, so I just got done reading The Dueling Neurosurgeons, which is a book about neuroscience that tells the story of neuroscience from the perspective of the discoverers and the victims of some of the most essential cases to understanding how the brain works. In this way, it tells the story of neuroscience without resorting to math or textbook equations. Following in Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, it introduces science without having to actually have you do the math and homework required. Because the book introduces a lot of concepts with the discussion of the scientists and doctors involved, I have to give a soft spoiler warning because I'm going to be talking about those concepts, and that might be why you want to read the books. But since I imagine you probably want to read it in the context of the people story, I will try and tone down that aspect more. But I still need to discuss them because damn, there are some unethical scientists in here, to the point where I think the book is unintentionally encouraging some unethical behavior, because so many of their scientists went and did something that is outside the social norms, to the point of like, oh, these are trash people. These are horrible people who did horrible things to other people in order to get this research done. Probably one of the best cases is in Kuru in New Guinea. There was a degenerative disease that was destroying an entire tribe of people, specifically children and women most of all. And a doctor decided that they cared a little too much about children and went to New Guinea despite the government's orders and performed a lot of experiments with the permission of the New Guinea tribe. And the way that they were able to do this is because that tribe believed that men would get stronger the more semen that they had. And this doctor approached the children and had a bargaining chip to make them stronger if they gave him some of the research. Oh yeah. He found out that it isn't transmitted via a few ways, and eventually he found out that it was transmitted via white brain cells, which were handed out to children, but occasionally eaten by the adults, who usually only eat the gray cells of the brain. Speaking of pedophiles, after the FBI arrested that scientist, I was expecting them to say that he had brain cancer of some sort, because they found out that the neurosurgery community found out that brain cancer might affect specific personalities and tastes, because they found a pedophile who had changed because they had brain cancer in a specific part of their head. Now, I'm sorry to give you another fear for your life, knowing that in fact brain cancer can make you have sexual urges towards something you really don't want to have sexual urges for. But it looks like brain cancer and brain damage of all sorts can cause personality changes, like with Phineas Gage, who had an entire rod go through his skull and basically lost his personality. Or a number of conspiracy theorists who have part of their, I believe, right brain, which interprets meaning onto objects, as opposed to the left brain, which interprets what the logic is. So they suddenly see things like themselves in the reflection, and they look different because they've aged, or they're not wearing clothes that's in their memory, and they think that they've had a body double. Things like that exist in neuroscience all the time, and that's just from I believe, a rifle round from Manchuria in that case. There's a whole bunch of different concepts in this book that change what people believe based on an injury or some kind of effect. Epilepsy, for example, tends to produce sacred feelings in the individual, like you are speaking to God, which Dostoevsky proclaimed to have written in his book. And some neurosurgeons now believe that characters like Joan of Arc may have been having epileptic seizures, which led them to feeling their religious zeal, or may have been hearing God with hallucinations with that epileptic feeling. We've also encountered instances, I say we as though I'm a neurosurgeon, neurosurgeons have also encountered instances of Spock-like people, or people who have had the emotional center taken from the brain. And in all those cases, they found that we are not the perfectly rational people that we say we are, because their life got completely screwed up after that. They were able to logically deduce a huge number of problems, but they were unable to hold even a single job because they didn't care whether they won or lost. Their emotion was taken out. It turns out that when we see data, we need to impart meaning onto it with emotion and with chemicals. Without that, we tend to just kind of dally along. The guy there, I don't even know why he continued to eat. Maybe it was because he had an emotional part of the brain that was unconnected to the part that experienced emotion. I feel like I would need to actually read the textbook to understand that case further, now that I'm thinking about it here. But he was unable to even do work on his job because he cared more about all these different possibilities than actually getting the work done. He stopped caring about his relationship with his wife and left it whole cloth to go sleep with a prostitute because that was a short-term gain, and his animal brain was like, ooh, we want that. Another woman, SM, was a woman who lost her fear response, more or less. And people say she lost her common sense, because it turns out a lot of what we do during the day is us assigning an emotion or an opinion to something that we've experienced. That actually might be why we can't learn as well from books, and why we need experience, is because we need to form opinions about very nuanced things. Whereas if we read about it, we know it, but we don't have that immediate gut reaction. She lost all of her fear response, but the part of her brain that keeps her fascinated, or like telling her that this is important, you need to pay attention to it, still worked for things that scared her. So she would go up to snakes, which she was desperately afraid of, and she would play with her tongues, and she would grow fascinated with them, because the brain was still saying, pay attention to this, but she had no fear whatsoever. She then did a bunch of outrageous things, like she offered to sleep with the doctor in front of her husband because she had no fear and she was feeling like a little bit of lust. Her husband got into a domestic dispute with her because of that, or perhaps because of other reasons. And she felt no fear as he was being violent towards her. Or I shouldn't say being violent towards her. It was implied, but it wasn't directly stated. They just said domestic dispute. She was robbed via gunpoint. She had a knife pointed to her throat. In all those instances, she was completely calm and unable to do more. The case files for those neurosurgeons is actually kind of an instance of comedy, because they kept trying to test her fear response by bringing her into crazier and crazier situations. So it's much more like, we performed psychological experiments on her by bringing her to haunted house after like creepy graveyard, etc. Just testing any responses to the fear thing, which is sort of an interesting report, according to the book. But yeah, there are just so many instances of the brain causing people to do crazy things. It turns out one of the reasons people might believe in the soul might actually be because of phantom limb syndrome. It turns out that we have a scaffold of the human body, or at least most people do, even if you're missing a limb. So even if you were born missing a limb, you have kids who say they count on their invisible fingers in math class because they have an idea on what's there. So when a person loses their hand, they still have that feeling there. They still have the nerve endings. And if you've ever heard that a blind person can hear or taste or have other senses that are improved by the lack of sight, it turns out that that's basically what phantom limb does. A part of your brain attaches to the missing limb, and but unfortunately, because it's kind of cross-wiring, like if your sense of smell starts attaching to your missing arm, then when you smell something that invokes a particular response, it will cause your hand to feel like it's there. But because the hand always feels like it's there, it causes, like Horatio Nelson said, I believe in the soul because my hand was missing and I could feel it there. And if the hand has a soul, then why not the rest of me? A weird method of reasoning to justify a belief that is held by people in the real world. Same thing with demons, actually. We've already talked about how epileptic seizures can cause a feeling of the divine. But what about a feeling of dread, of hell, of terror? And what about paralysis demons? So it turns out that paralysis demons is basically when you go to sleep and your mind is working exactly as you expect it to, but you remain conscious. And this means that your body doesn't respond to signals from your brain anymore, because it's told your body, hey, you're unconscious, so anything that you say to like move your arm, move your leg, isn't going to work. This constricts your throat as well, so it suddenly feels like you're being caught. You're conscious and you're awake, you're looking through the room. Your part of your brain that says conjure dreams, so conjure somewhat hallucinations, is still active, but your eyes are still awake. And because of that, you start to see things around the room. You can't move, you feel a constriction on your throat, that could reasonably scare you. which triggers the part of the amygdala that's fear, which goes into your dream sequence to start producing nightmares. And as soon as you see a hallucination of a nightmare, that will cause the amygdala to act more and give you more and more fear, to the point where you are actually potentially experiencing the most fear that your brain can possibly feel, because you're conjuring more and more things that you're frightened of, and you might even get like a PTSD episode from one of these fear effects. So paralysis demons are literally things in your room or figments of your imagination that are becoming the most frightening thing your brain can imagine, which is terrifying, quite literally. However, because it happens most often when your brain is at rest in the back, if you sleep on your side, that can really reduce the risk of having a paralysis demon effect. So if you have that effect, and I'm so sorry, that's one answer to that. This book is just chock full of different examples of strange brain behavior, like how they discovered chemical versus structural differences based on the assassinations of presidents. I've already gone on for far too long with this discussion, just because this has been such an interesting insight into the mind, and how I'll probably take this understanding of how human brains work and incorporate it into how I think about how people work and how people understand the world. I'll also especially take that idea that emotion imparts meaning into different facts, and use that to understand how I have differences with my fellow man, and how those differences could be caused by different experiences. So in both an enlightening way and an intellectual way, I really appreciate this book. And it looks like I have to go, so thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow. Weird science. Plastic tubes and pots and pans, bits and pieces, and the magic from the hand. We're making weird science.